Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the history of the culture war, from 1960s rebellion to 2025's identity crisis, where we will trace how a seemingly stable, prosperous America turned into a society locked in endless battles over identity, morality, and who really owns the story of the nation. In the background of this opening slide you can see the timeline running from the end of World War II into the early 1960s, and it is easy to look at those years and think of them as a golden age, booming economy, rising suburbs, steady jobs, and a feeling that the United States was on top of the world. But the whole point of this first part of the story is that the calm was hiding a lot of pressure. After 1945, the United States emerges from the war with its industrial base intact, its rivals shattered, and a new role as a global superpower. And at home you get the image we all know from old advertisements and family photos: the nuclear family in the suburbs, the new car in the driveway, kids in neatly pressed school clothes, fathers in suits heading downtown, mothers expected to manage the home, and a sense that life has a clear script. Politically, there is a relatively narrow band of acceptable opinion. Both major parties more or less agree on the basic framework of the welfare state, containment abroad, and gradual economic growth at home. And this produces what historians sometimes call a post-war consensus, the idea that the big questions had been settled, fascism defeated, the Depression overcome, and now it is just about managing prosperity. On the slide, when you see the map of suburban expansion and the interstate highways, that is not just about roads and houses, it is about a social order that physically moves people into new spaces, separating city and suburb, work and home, white and black, rich and poor, often without anyone needing to say it out loud. But if you look closely at the chart of real wages, union density, and the share of income going to the middle class, you can also see why this era felt so secure to many. Organized labor is relatively strong, manufacturing is humming, and for a large segment of the population, each year seems to promise a bit more comfort than the last. Now here is the twist that matters for the culture war. Beneath that reassuring data there are fault lines: legally enforced segregation in the South and quieter forms of discrimination in the North, women who stepped into factories during the war being quietly pushed back into the home, religious authorities and local school boards setting the tone for public life, and a rising generation of young people who will soon question why they are expected to simply accept the rules they inherited. This is why I say the consensus was not just a shared belief, it was also a system, a network of laws, economic policies, housing programs, media norms, and educational structures that rewarded people who fit the mold and made it harder for those who did not. So as we begin this journey, I want you to keep a simple question in mind: how do those systems, the monetary choices that fuel growth and suburban mortgages, the political institutions that limit what can be debated, the legal frameworks that keep some people out and lift others up, how do all of those shape which cultural fights eventually explode into the open? The story of the culture war is not simply that people suddenly disagreed about values in the 1960s, the story is that for almost 2 decades the country built a very specific kind of order, prosperous but unequal, confident but anxious, and by the early 1960s that order was straining under problems it could no longer ignore, setting the stage for rebellion, realignment, and the long conflicts we are still living with today. When people throw around the phrase culture war, it can sound dramatic, almost like a marketing slogan, but on this slide I want to pin down what it actually means in a way that helps the rest of the story make sense. A culture war is not just a heated argument about a law or a tax rate, it is a long-running struggle over values, symbols, and ways of life, fought in courts and classrooms, on television, in church pews, and now on social media feeds. Think of it this way: if a normal policy disagreement is a debate about how to fix a pothole, a culture war conflict is an argument over who really owns the neighborhood, who belongs there, and what kind of people are good neighbors in the first place. That is why culture war issues often focus on topics that stand in for bigger moral questions: flags and kneeling during anthems, school curriculums, the definition of marriage or gender, what holidays we celebrate, what books sit on library shelves. These are not just random controversies, they are signals. They tell people this is our tribe war, those are the people who threaten what we value. Political parties and consultants realized over time that when you run on abstract budgets and complicated regulations, you may get a shrug, but if you connect those same policies to identity or morality, you suddenly tap into fear, pride, shame, and hope. So instead of simply arguing over a welfare program in terms of numbers, you can frame it as a battle over the dignity of work, or the survival of the family, or the fate of taxpayers versus takers. The same thing happens with crime, education, and immigration. Underneath, there are material interests and institutional incentives, but the public story is told in moral colors. Notice also who the main actors are in these culture wars. It is not just presidents and members of Congress. Churches teach their congregations how to see the nation's struggles through theological lenses. Universities shape the intellectual vocabulary people use to talk about race, gender, and power. Think tanks craft language that turns complex economic or legal debates into emotionally charged slogans. Advocacy groups frame court cases and ballot initiatives as fights for survival, for the soul of the country. Even corporations, especially later in the story, realize that branding themselves on one side or another can buy goodwill with some consumers and regulators, although it can alienate others. The key insight on this slide is that culture war is a system, not a single shouting match. It is a pattern in which values and identity are turned into tools for organizing coalitions, raising money, and managing social tensions, and once that pattern is in place, it becomes very hard to step back and simply say, let us just fix the pothole, because every issue feels like a test of who you are and which side of history you stand on. When we get to the 1960s, it is tempting to picture a sudden explosion of rebellion, as if young people simply woke up one morning, decided to grow their hair long, and overturn everything their parents believed. But what is really happening in this period is a collision between the post-war system you just saw and a massive demographic wave. You have the baby boom generation coming of age, the largest cohort of young Americans in the country's history, and because of post-war prosperity and government programs they are attending college in numbers that would have seemed unbelievable to their grandparents. Picture campuses swelling with students who have enough security to ask big questions about race, war, and meaning rather than just worrying about survival, and you start to see why protest movements catch fire. The civil rights movement challenges legally enforced segregation and the deeper habits of a society that claimed to be the leader of the free world while denying basic rights to millions of its own citizens. Student activists demand not just formal equality but a say in how universities are run, what is taught, and who gets to speak. The anti-war movement grows out of a draft system that asks young men to fight in Vietnam for policies they often do not understand, while television for the first time beams images of the conflict into the living room. Around the same time, new rights claims emerge from groups that had long been expected to stay quiet. Women question rigid gender roles and push for control over their work and family lives. Gay and lesbian activists insist that their existence and relationships be recognized rather than criminalized or pathologized, and campus free speech movements argue that authorities should not simply ban ideas they find dangerous or inconvenient. All of this is happening in a society that had promised that the welfare state and steady growth would tame conflict, so each protest, each sit-in and march, looks to supporters like a demand that America finally live up to its ideals, and to critics like an attack on order itself. Politically, these movements begin to crack the New Deal coalition that had held together northern urban workers, southern whites, racial minorities, and liberal intellectuals under one broad party umbrella. As civil rights legislation passes and party leaders take clearer stands, some white Southern voters and working-class ethnics feel alienated and begin to drift toward candidates who speak the language of law, order, and traditional values. Others, including many younger, urban, and minority voters, move toward a more explicitly liberal or radical politics. In other words, the 1960s are not just a story of rebellion for its own sake, they are a story of realignment of the old post-war consensus being pulled apart and rearranged as new rights claims and new social identities force Americans to decide, often for the first time, which side of these issues they are on and what that means for their political home. As the shock waves of the 1960s roll through American life, a new kind of politics begins to form around a simple promise, to restore order, and this is where the language of backlash and law and order comes into focus. On television, people see images of urban riots, burning buildings, clashes between police and protesters, and for many viewers who are not in those streets it feels as if the country is coming apart. Crime rates are rising in many cities, some neighborhoods are losing jobs and stability, and the evening news compresses complex local stories into a stream of dramatic images, so it is not surprising that politicians start talking to what they call the silent majority, the people who see themselves as hardworking, patriotic, and increasingly uneasy. The message is carefully framed. It says, you are not extremists, you are not bigots, you are simply tired of chaos, tired of feeling like the rules keep changing without your consent. Law and order candidates promise tougher policing, harsher sentencing, and a return to respect for authority, but those policies do not land on a neutral map, they land on a landscape already shaped by racial segregation, unequal schools, and concentrated poverty. When federal and state governments pass major crime bills, fund more police, and encourage stricter penalties, they are not just dealing with street crime, they are also responding to and reshaping cultural divides: who lives where, who is seen as dangerous, who is seen as respectable. Conflicts over school desegregation and busing are a perfect illustration. Courts say that separate schools are unconstitutional, but actually integrating them often requires busing children across neighborhood lines that were created by years of housing policy and private discrimination. For some families, especially those who had just moved out of crowded cities into modest suburbs, this feels like an attack on their fragile sense of progress, and so a legal effort to dismantle racial hierarchy is reframed as a question of parental rights, local control, and neighborhood pride. In speeches and campaigns, racial and regional tensions are translated into a moral story about values and patriotism. Opposition to certain reforms is rarely advertised as "I want to keep this group out," it is presented instead as "I want safe streets, I want my kids to have discipline in schools, I want to respect the flag and the police." The result is a powerful political formula, tying concerns about crime and social change to a broader narrative that the country has drifted away from its core virtues and needs firm leadership to pull it back. At the same time, communities that bear the brunt of these policies, especially black and poor neighborhoods, experience a very different reality: more aggressive policing, more people funneled into courts and prisons, and more distrust between residents and institutions that claim to protect them. The long-term consequence of this period is that crime, schooling, and welfare are no longer just policy areas, they become cultural battlefields where each side believes it is fighting for the soul of the country, and once those issues are placed inside a law and order frame, it becomes much harder to discuss the underlying economic and institutional choices that helped create the tensions in the first place. By the late 1970s, the promise of that earlier post-war prosperity is clearly cracking, and the period that follows, often associated with the Reagan era, ties markets and morals together in a way that reshapes the culture war for decades. Inflation is running high, people see prices climbing at the grocery store and the gas pump, savings eroding, mortgages becoming harder to manage, and at the same time unemployment is stubborn. Economists call this mixed stagflation, and it is a rude surprise for a system that had assumed you could always trade a bit more inflation for a bit less unemployment. Into this crisis step politicians and advisors who argue that the old toolkit of heavy regulation, strong unions, and ever-growing government programs has reached its limits and may even be the problem. The response is a package of policies that many viewers will recognize from headlines about tax cuts and deregulation. Top marginal tax rates are slashed, especially on high earners. Industries like airlines, trucking, and finance see rules loosened. The federal government signals that it will be friendlier to business, less supportive of organized labor, and more willing to let markets set wages and prices. If you look at the charts from this period, you can see unions steadily losing power, especially after high-profile confrontations, while corporate profits and the financial sector gradually gain weight in the economy. But the key move for the culture war is that these economic changes are sold as moral as well as practical. Around Reagan coalesces a new alliance often called the religious right or the moral majority, pastors and activists who argue that America's problems are not only about bad economic policy but about spiritual drift, about divorce, abortion, pornography, drugs, and a loss of discipline. They find common ground with free market conservatives on a simple storyline. The country became soft and dependent, families broke down, people stopped taking responsibility, and big government encouraged all of this by rewarding idleness and punishing success. Shrinking welfare programs, cutting taxes, limiting unions, and getting tough on crime can then be presented not just as budget measures but as ways to restore virtue, to revive the traditional family, to put fathers back in charge and communities back on solid footing. On the ground, these policies and the global shifts that accompany them have complicated effects. Some regions and industries boom, especially in finance, technology, and services. Others, especially older manufacturing towns, lose jobs and never fully recover. Families respond by sending more adults into the workforce, patching together multiple jobs, and relying less on the single breadwinner ideal that earlier propaganda had advertised, even as politicians still invoke that image. Community institutions change as well, with some churches thriving by preaching a message that mixes personal salvation with a particular economic and political vision, and others struggling to keep up as their members move or slide out of the middle class. The important thing to see on this slide is that markets and morals have been braided together. When leaders talk about cutting a program or changing a tax bracket, they are also talking about what kind of person counts as responsible, what kind of family deserves help, and which communities are seen as makers or takers. Economic policy becomes one of the main stages on which the culture war is fought, and the long-term consequences, including widening inequality and regional divides, set the conditions for the resentment and identity conflicts we will see later in the story. By the time we enter the era of globalization that accelerates in the 1980s and 1990s, what had once been mostly domestic economic change starts to feel like a planetary reshuffling, and the consequences for culture and identity are enormous even if most people first experience it as a factory closing or a different label on a product. Trade liberalization and new trade agreements make it easier for firms to move production to places with cheaper labor or different regulations, and financial markets, powered by new technology and policy choices, can shift vast amounts of capital around the world at high speed. For executives and professionals in global cities, this can look like opportunity, new markets, new investments, new travel, and a sense of belonging to a border-crossing elite. For workers in towns built around a single plant, a mine, or a port, globalization can feel more like abandonment. The plant that anchored the local tax base and sponsored the Little League team suddenly relocates or automates, leaving behind not only unemployment but closed diners, shrinking school budgets, and a creeping sense that the center of gravity has moved somewhere else. If you look at maps of deindustrialized regions, especially in parts of the United States and other advanced economies, you see clusters of communities where job losses, wage stagnation, and population decline have become normal. At the same time, in coastal or metropolitan hubs, you can trace skyscrapers, tech campuses, and luxury housing sprouting up as finance and high-skill services benefit from integrated global markets. The gap between productivity growth and median wages widens, which means the overall economy can look healthy on a chart while large groups of people feel like they are running in place or slipping backward. These economic shifts do not stay in the realm of numbers, they feed directly into identity. In some spaces, especially in universities, corporations, and media centers with international connections, a cosmopolitan identity gains prestige. People emphasize their ties to global causes, diverse networks, and a world citizen outlook. In other spaces, particularly where people feel left behind, there is a renewed emphasis on local traditions, national symbols, and older forms of solidarity, sometimes religious, sometimes ethnic, sometimes tied to region and occupation. Political parties, which once organized more openly around class and material interests, begin to talk more in terms of cultural markers, lifestyle, and values, even when the underlying disagreements are about who bears the costs of trade, monetary policy, and regulatory choices. When someone in a small town says it feels as if the system forgot them, they might express that as anger at distant technocrats, at cultural elites on television, or at newcomers who seem to be doing better, even though the real drivers are complex decisions about currency, capital flows, and comparative advantage that most voters never get to approve directly. The globalization era, in other words, weaves inequality and identity together, creating a world where people can live in the same nation but inhabit very different realities, one where the airport lounge feels like home and another where the boarded-up factory is the landscape of everyday life, and those diverging experiences become fuel for the culture war that follows. If you want to understand why today's culture war feels louder, faster, and harder to escape than anything in the past, you have to look at what happened to media, because the communication system that once gave most Americans a shared, if limited, set of stories has turned into a maze of echo chambers where different groups almost live in different realities. For much of the post-war period, you had a small number of national television networks, a few dominant newspapers, and local radio, which meant that even when people disagreed, they were at least hearing about the same events from a relatively narrow range of gatekeepers. Starting in the 1970s and 1980s, cable television breaks that monopoly, giving space to specialized channels and eventually to explicitly partisan news outlets that discover there is a loyal audience for commentary that confirms their worldview and treats politics as a daily drama. Talk radio does something similar, creating communities of listeners who tune in for hours at a time to hear hosts blend news, opinion, and entertainment into a narrative where the stakes always feel sky high. Then the internet arrives, and with it websites, blogs, and forums that strip away many of the old barriers to entry. Suddenly, anyone with time, skill, or sheer persistence can reach an audience, and niche communities can flourish around very specific grievances, identities, or causes. At first this looks like pure democratization, more voices, more perspectives, more opportunities for marginalized stories to find an audience, and there is truth in that, but there is another layer that really drives the culture war dynamic, the business model. Most of these platforms make money by capturing attention and selling it to advertisers, which means they are rewarded when you stay on the site, click, comment, and share. Calm, balanced content rarely generates that kind of engagement. Outrage, fear, and moral certainty do. So over time, algorithms that were designed to maximize clicks learn a simple lesson. If you serve people content that confirms their side is righteous and the other side is crazy or evil, they tend to stick around. Your feed then fills with stories that show the worst behavior of your opponents, the most extreme examples of policies you already dislike, and the most heated responses from your own side, which makes it feel as if the entire world is on the brink at every moment. Because different platforms and channels serve different audiences, two people living on the same street can open their phones and see completely different versions of the country. One might see endless clips of campus protests and corporate diversity trainings and conclude that a wave of ideological control is sweeping everything. Another might see a stream of videos about police abuses, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and attacks on LGBTQ people and conclude that rights are under constant siege. In each case, examples exist in the real world, but the selection and repetition of those examples create a distorted picture that leaves almost no room for nuance or shared context. Over time, these media ecosystems do not just reflect the culture war, they help manufacture and escalate it, rewarding the politicians, commentators, and activists who speak in the sharpest terms, treating compromise as betrayal and curiosity as weakness. The old system had its own blind spots and biases, but it did at least force different groups to overhear one another. In the fragmented media landscape, it is entirely possible to live inside a moral universe where your side is always defending civilization itself, and the other side is always attacking it, which makes it much easier to see neighbors as enemies and much harder to recognize the deeper systems, including economic incentives and institutional choices, that quietly push the conflict forward. If you want to see how culture war battles moved from the streets and television screens into the everyday routines of institutions, universities are one of the clearest places to look, because they did not just grow in size after the 1960s, they changed in structure, adding layers of bureaucracies that now play a direct role in how identity and conflict are managed. After mid-century expansion, higher education keeps widening its doors, more students from more backgrounds attend college, and government grants and loans help fund that growth. At the same time, universities become subject to a web of federal and state rules that arise from civil rights law, Title IX, and a series of court cases about discrimination and harassment. The intention behind many of these rules is to prevent exclusion and abuse, to make sure students and staff are not denied opportunities because of race, sex, or other protected characteristics. To comply, universities build administrative offices, diversity and inclusion centers, equity committees, and compliance departments, staffed by people whose job is to monitor policies, process complaints, and design training. The result is a campus environment where questions about speech, curriculum, hiring, and student life are often channeled through formal procedures rather than being left entirely to informal norms. When a student or employee feels targeted or uncomfortable, the path forward may involve filing a report that triggers an investigation, mediation, or sanctions, and these processes can look very different depending on the institution and the people running them. Supporters argue that without these structures, vulnerable groups would be left with no recourse in the face of harassment or exclusion. Critics argue that when administrative bodies are given broad mandates to enforce evolving ideas about offense or harm, they can easily drift into policing expression and enforcing a particular worldview. This is where the term identity politics often enters the discussion. On campuses, identity-based frameworks are used to analyze literature, history, and social science, to organize student groups, and to shape programming, with the aim of recognizing how race, gender, sexuality, and other categories influence experience and power. For some, this is a long overdue correction to blind spots in older curricula that treated one group's story as universal. For others, it can feel like a narrowing of what can be said, as if individuals are being sorted and judged primarily by group labels. Corporate and government workplaces borrow elements of this model, building their own diversity initiatives, training sessions, and reporting systems, so the campus logic spreads into the broader economy. What makes this such a central front in the culture war is not only the ideas themselves, but the fact that they are embedded in bureaucratic procedures backed by funding, accreditation pressures, and legal risk. When a speaker is disinvited, when a syllabus is revised after a complaint, or when an employee sits through a mandatory workshop, both advocates and critics see more than a single event. They see institutions deciding which identities and narratives will be formally recognized and which will be quietly discouraged. Over time, each side tells a different story about what is happening. One story says that universities and bureaucracies are finally building structures to protect dignity and widen participation. The other story says that those same structures are becoming tools for enforcing ideological conformity. Either way, the interplay of law, administration, and identity has turned campuses and offices into key arenas where the deeper tensions of the culture war are worked out in forms, meetings, and quiet decisions that rarely make the front page, but shape how millions of people learn, work, and speak. When we talk about the culture war, it is easy to focus on flags, slogans, and campus debates, but underneath a lot of that noise sits a quieter story about money, policy, and resentment, because when people feel that the economic game is rigged, they often express that anger in cultural language. Think back to the crises that punctuate the late 20th and early 21st century, the inflation of the 1970s that made paychecks feel smaller each month, the housing bubbles that made home ownership either a ticket to wealth or an impossible dream, and the financial crash of 2008 when people watched banks and large institutions get rescued while families lost homes and jobs. Central banks and governments respond to these shocks with powerful tools, adjusting interest rates, creating new lending facilities, buying assets, and designing bailouts that, on paper, are meant to keep the system from collapsing. If you look at charts of stock indexes, bond yields, or housing prices after these interventions, you often see a striking pattern. Financial markets recover far faster than ordinary wages, and property in certain regions becomes dramatically more expensive. From the perspective of someone who owns a portfolio or multiple homes, this can look like a remarkable comeback. From the perspective of someone whose main asset is their labor or a single modest house, it can feel like a rigged casino where the house always wins. Over time, these repeated episodes teach people a lesson, not in technical economics, but in lived experience. When things go wrong, the institutions that manage money find ways to stabilize the top of the system first and hope the benefits trickle down later. That sense of unfairness is rarely expressed in the language of interest rate corridors or balance sheet expansions. Instead, it is translated into anger at elites, at distant technocrats, at coastal professionals, or at whatever group seems to symbolize the people who always land on their feet. Rising housing costs divide generations, with older owners sitting on appreciating assets while younger renters face spiraling rents and down payments that feel out of reach, and those tensions often show up in debates about lifestyle and values, about who is responsible, who is lazy, who is entitled. Fiscal policies, too, can sharpen resentments, as tax credits, subsidies, and relief programs are designed in ways that benefit some sectors and regions more than others, creating a patchwork where neighbors in similar situations may be treated very differently depending on how they fit into the categories officials chose. Over and over, people see headlines about billions allocated here, trillions guaranteed there, and yet their own lives feel fragile, one medical bill or layoff away from disaster. When that happens, cultural narratives rush in to explain the gap. Some conclude that the problem lies with other groups supposedly cutting the line, others blame the moral failings of distant leaders who talk about shared sacrifice while seeming to live by a different set of rules. The key point on this slide is that monetary and policy choices, especially around crises, do not just move numbers on a screen, they change who feels secure and who feels disposable, and those feelings feed directly into the bitterness and suspicion that color so many culture war conflicts, even when the arguments on the surface are about flags, holidays, or language rather than interest rates and balance sheets. As we move into the 2010s and up to 2025, the culture war shifts into overdrive, because the economic and media changes we have been talking about collide with an era of permanent online mobilization and a series of crises that push identity questions to the center of politics. Social media platforms become not just places to share vacation photos but engines for organizing, shaming, fundraising, and storytelling, where a single video of a police encounter, a protest, or a controversial statement can reach millions of people in hours and trigger marches, boycotts, or counter-boycotts. Movements around policing, racial justice, and state violence erupt in the streets and on hashtags, while in other corners of the internet, populist insurgencies rail against global institutions, immigration policies, and what they describe as a distant cultural elite. At the same time, debates over sex, gender, and identity that had been building for years move into mainstream law and policy, with arguments over bathroom access, sports participation, education guidelines, and the very terms people should use to address one another. Immigration remains a flashpoint as well, with some leaders presenting newcomers as a source of renewal and diversity, and others framing migration as a threat to jobs, security, or national cohesion. Then a global pandemic arrives and acts like a pressure test for every system we have discussed. Public health measures, school closures, mask and vaccine rules, and emergency spending programs are rolled out through a mix of expert advice and political bargaining, and almost immediately they are interpreted through cultural lenses. For some, following guidelines becomes a way to protect the vulnerable and trust institutions. For others, mandates feel like an overreach, a sign that bureaucracies and corporations can now decide where you work, where your kids learn, and even whether you can keep your business open. Large firms and universities adopt official stances on many of these issues, issuing statements, changing logos, revising training, or disciplining staff, and in doing so they send a signal that certain identities and narratives are not just acceptable but officially endorsed. That pleases some constituencies and angers others, who see it as proof that powerful institutions have taken sides. Political parties adapt to this environment by leaning harder into symbolic fights, staging high-profile battles over statues, school library books, corporate messaging, and social media moderation, while often leaving the more technical questions of monetary policy and long-term debt off the front page. In this world, identity is not just a description, it is a currency. Being seen as a defender of one group or a critic of another can bring clicks, donations, and votes. The result is a landscape where many citizens feel they are walking through a minefield of unwritten rules, unsure what can be said at work, online, or even at the dinner table without touching off a conflict. Some respond by withdrawing from public life, others by doubling down on activism or counter-activism. By the mid-2020s, it can feel as if every topic, from public health to children's entertainment, has been pulled into a struggle over who gets to define reality, which stories are told, and whose sense of identity will shape the rules that everyone else has to live under. On this slide we zoom out and ask a simple but uncomfortable question: when a society is locked in a culture war, who actually gets to manage that conflict, and how? Because there is a world of difference between rules imposed from above and norms that emerge from people choosing how to live together from below. Centralization is what happens when governments, school boards, courts, and even tech platforms decide that certain cultural disputes are too important to leave to chance, so they write them directly into law, regulation, education standards, or terms of service. You see this when legislators pass bills telling teachers what topics they cannot discuss, when agencies issue detailed guidelines about which words are acceptable in official documents, when courts hand down sweeping rulings that tell 50 very different states to treat a contested social question in exactly the same way, or when social media companies, sometimes under political pressure, set policies that determine which opinions can be monetized or banned. The argument for centralization is always similar. It says the stakes are so high that we cannot afford patchwork solutions, we need uniform rules to protect rights, stop harm, or preserve national identity. Yet as you look across history, you notice a recurring pattern. Top-down efforts to engineer virtue or unity often generate backlash, loopholes, and weird side effects. A speech code designed to prevent genuine harassment might be interpreted broadly and used to silence a controversial but serious critique. A law meant to protect a traditional norm might be enforced unevenly, fueling anger among those who feel targeted and driving the very behavior it was supposed to reduce underground where it is harder to see or address. Platform moderation rules, written in a hurry to curb disinformation or hate speech, might end up reinforcing the trust gap between institutions and users, as some posts vanish while others that seem similar remain visible, feeding the suspicion that someone behind the curtain is picking sides. In contrast, voluntary orders rely on the fact that human beings constantly form associations, markets, and communities without waiting for a central planner. Think about the variety of schools, media outlets, religious congregations, neighborhood groups, and online communities that emerge when people are free to gather around shared values and experiment with different ways of living. A city with a mix of public, private, charter, and cooperative schools will see families sort themselves according to educational philosophies, and over time, some models will attract more students because they actually work better rather than because a distant authority said they must. Independent media organizations can build audiences by speaking to specific concerns without every editorial line being set by a regulatory agency. Local civic groups can agree on norms that fit their circumstances and culture, instead of having one national template dropped on each town regardless of history or context. None of these voluntary systems are perfect. They can be insular, unfair, or short-sighted, but they allow people to move, to opt out, and to create alternatives without needing permission from a central office. The heart of the tension on this slide is that culture war issues tempt leaders to reach for centralized tools whenever a new controversy erupts, because it feels easier to pass one big rule than to tolerate messy local experimentation. The historical question for us is whether that impulse, however well-intentioned, gradually erodes the space where free individuals and communities can negotiate their own arrangements, and whether trying to impose a single moral or cultural settlement on millions of diverse people actually ends up deepening division, as each side races to seize the machinery of central control before the other side uses it against them. As we near the end of this story, it is easy to get lost in the big systems, the charts, the acronyms, the institutions, and forget that none of it moves without individual human beings making choices, which is what this slide is really about: moral questions and human agency inside the culture war. Every law we have mentioned, every school policy, every corporate statement or social media rule was drafted, approved, and enforced by specific people with their own beliefs, ambitions, and fears, and every protest, boycott, or boycott of a boycott started when someone decided that staying quiet felt worse than speaking up. Think about activists who risk careers and safety to expose corruption or abuse, parents who attend boring school board meetings month after month because they believe their children's education is being quietly reshaped, students who challenge a campus rule they see as unjust, or workers who organize, leak documents, or blow the whistle when internal practices clash with their conscience. None of these people are pure heroes or villains. But they are reminders that the culture war is not just something that happens to us, it is something we help steer. At the same time, individuals are never operating in a vacuum. Structures like media incentives, employment rules, debt burdens, and social networks nudge people toward some choices and away from others. A police officer deciding when to use force, a professor choosing a syllabus, a content moderator evaluating a controversial post, a pastor writing a sermon about a hot-button topic, all of them are weighing not only what they believe is right, but what their institution will tolerate, what their peers expect, and what consequences might follow. Many people feel torn between loyalties to family, faith, class, nation, and profession, and the culture war often forces those loyalties into direct conflict. A journalist balancing truth-telling against the risk of confirming the other side's narrative, a small business owner torn between personal convictions and customer expectations, a public official caught between expert advice and voter anger. The crucial point is that structures and incentives matter a lot, but they do not completely erase responsibility. People really do have moments where they can choose to escalate or de-escalate, to caricature or to listen, to weaponize a rule or to interpret it with mercy. History is full of examples where the same system produced very different outcomes because a handful of individuals chose courage over convenience, or, on the darker side, chose to go along with something they knew was wrong because it was easier, safer, or more profitable. So as we analyze the culture war through the lens of economics and institutions, this slide asks you to keep one more question in mind. When you strip away the slogans, what kind of person do these systems reward? What habits of character do they encourage or punish? And how might our own small choices, multiplied across millions of lives, shift the trajectory of these conflicts in ways no pundit or planner can fully predict? As we wrap up this journey from the post-war suburbs to the identity battles of the 2020s, I want you to step back and see the long arc we have traced, because the culture war is not just a collection of random arguments, it is the story of how a particular set of economic choices, political structures, and media systems turn deep but manageable disagreements into something that often feels like permanent low-grade civil conflict. We began with the post-war consensus, a world of apparent stability where rising middle-class prosperity, strong unions, and suburban expansion gave many Americans a sense that history was moving steadily forward, even as racial hierarchy, rigid gender roles, and hidden anxieties built pressure under the surface. We watched the 1960s crack that shell, as civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, feminists, and other movements forced the country to confront realities it had preferred to ignore, triggering realignment as old political coalitions splintered and new ones formed. We saw how backlash politics and law and order rhetoric translated fear of crime and disorder into policies that reshaped policing, prisons, and schools, often along lines that tracked race and class even when the language used was about respect and safety. We followed the rise of market-centered reforms and the alliance between free market advocates and religious conservatives in the Reagan era, where economic deregulation and tax changes were sold as moral renewal as much as technical policy, and we saw how globalization then widened gaps between booming global cities and hollowed out industrial regions, tying inequality directly to questions of identity and belonging. We examined how the old media system fractured into a landscape of cable channels, talk radio, websites, and social platforms that reward outrage and certainty, building echo chambers where each side sees only the worst of the other, and how universities and bureaucracies built new structures around identity and compliance, turning abstract theories into everyday rules and procedures that many people experienced as either overdue protection or creeping control. We followed the money through inflation, financial crises, and housing booms, noticing how central interventions often stabilized the top first and left many ordinary people feeling abandoned, and we watched as those economic frustrations were translated into suspicion of elites, anger at neighbors, and cultural narratives about who deserves what. In the most recent decade, we saw how social media activism, populist movements, debates over gender and race, immigration fights, and even a pandemic merged into a constant stream of identity battles, with institutions and corporations taking visible stances that convinced many citizens the system itself had picked a side. Underneath it all, we kept returning to the tension between centralized solutions and voluntary orders, between the impulse to settle cultural questions once and for all through law or regulation and the messy, sometimes frustrating freedom of letting diverse communities work things out through persuasion, association, and exit. And finally, we reminded ourselves that none of this is automatic, that real people, with consciences and blind spots, make choices every day that either inflame or soften these conflicts. So as you leave this video, I want to leave you with a few questions rather than a neat answer. What kind of institutions actually help people live together across deep disagreement without constantly reaching for coercion? How have monetary and political systems quietly shaped which cultural fights come to the surface and which stay invisible? And where in your own life do you still see spaces for voluntary cooperation that are not yet captured by the culture war logic? If you found this helpful or thought-provoking, please like the video, leave a comment with your own perspective or a topic you would like us to dig into next, and subscribe to Truth Behind History if you want more episodes that treat the past with both honesty and curiosity. There is a lot more to uncover, and if you enjoy history that connects big systems to real human lives without talking down to you, you are exactly the audience this channel is here for.